Welcome to the G2 on 5G. It's the inside information on everything 5G related, from end devices, infrastructure, carrier services, and compelling use cases. It's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, Senior Analyst for Networking Infrastructure and Carrier Services. I'm based in Austin, Texas. And with me on the Zoom line is Anshel Sag in beautiful San Diego. With that, let's get started. I'm going to launch into my first topic for this week. And it's around an announcement that appeared in an RCR Wireless story around China setting new regulations for the procurement of technology equipment. In my mind, this is the other shoe dropping with respect to some of the things that we've seen the U.S. announce with respect to the Team Telecom initiative that was announced via presidential order on April 4th. And also an ongoing discussion around the possibility of requiring fabrication manufacturers of semiconductors to actually be issued license if they're supplying any semiconductors to China. So I really sort of view this, even though I think the Chinese government is saying that it's not in response to that, but I kind of view this as the other shoe dropping. Anshel, any comment there, any perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what's been happening when it comes to the Chinese government and the US government around 5G and telecom has been a lot of tit for tat.
Yeah.
But the funny part is that if you really look at the long-term view of how these things have been going on, this kind of stuff has been going on for years. I mean, the Chinese government at one point was trying to deploy a strategy that required Chinese companies or companies wanting to work in China to submit their source code to the Chinese government,
Mm-hmm.
which is insane. They kind of backed off on that, but not entirely. And basically, like there are so many fundamental incompatibilities with a lot of these companies and governments that I only see the rifts widening.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
the
I
new
yeah,
regulations are only a continuation of that.
no, I agree. Yeah, I agree. I think it's just another salvo in the ongoing trade discussions between both the U.S. and China. With respect to end devices, let's shift a little bit. I know you cover Apple pretty closely,
Mhm.
and they've been sort of late to the party with a 5G enabled phone. I think you've got some news to share there and some perspective.
Yeah, well, they did launch a new phone last week, which was the iPhone SE.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of a low cost phone, and that was a 4G phone. But what we're really interested in is the first 5G iPhone, which
Mm-hmm.
was supposed to be this fall, around the September timeframe. But now there's rumors that the new 5G iPhone might be pushed back by a month, which
Hmm.
makes total sense because if you look at the way Apple scales up their manufacturing of their new iPhones, they start scaling and doing the proofing of the volume manufacturing now.
Mm-hmm.
And if the Chinese factories or the Japanese factories or the Korean factories where they get components from or build certain parts of the iPhone at um, are not operational, or people from the US, like Apple engineers, can't fly there, then
Mm-hmm.
there's possibility that there's going to be delays. This is actually something I discussed with other people recently.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are kind of in consensus that there's a very high likelihood that the way Apple's business works and the way their supply chain, operates, there might be a way they can make it work, but it's going to be very difficult. And it sounds like the rumors about a month delay are starting to circulate. So we may get the new iPhone in November instead of October, or mid October instead of mid September.
Interesting.
But
So
yeah,
so it
it'll
sounds
it'll
like, yeah.
squeeze their fourth quarter, which is I think the real big issue.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And so you don't think this is tied to like their modem development effort, right? Because there was
Oh no,
the
that's so
yeah,
far down the road
yeah.
that they're
They're
still
using
gonna use a
Qualcomm, right?
Qualcomm modem now. I
Yeah.
believe they have a 5-year agreement with a 7-year
Mm-hmm.
license agreement. So they've given themselves the appropriate amount of time with some wiggle room to develop their own 5G modems, so that they can cut Qualcomm out. I mean, ultimately, their business, that their goal is to cut everybody out because they want to
Yeah.
have their own scale. And honestly, I don't think it's a bad thing for Apple consumers because, you know, you'll have a 5G modem in your iPad, you'll have a 5G
Right.
modem in your iMac, in your MacBook, in everything that Apple makes will have a modem unless, it's a, Mac Pro.
Right.
So I think it makes sense long term, but I don't think that's really a factor here. It's
Okay.
mostly just that, they're building their first 5G phone and they might be doing millimeter wave. Nobody's entirely sure yet.
Hmm.
But if they are doing millimeter wave, it's like, an additional thing that they've never done before.
Yeah, yeah. Millimeter wave is quite challenging. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So thanks for sharing that perspective. Let's shift a little bit. My second topic this week is talking about Nokia. They've been in the news quite a bit. Initially, a few months ago, there were discussions around their looking to sell different parts of their business that maybe were underperforming. Last week, we heard rumors around a potential hostile takeover. None of that has really sort of come to light, but it was interesting this week. The company announced a pretty big 5G win with Bharati, if I'm pronouncing that right, Airtel, and they're an operator in India. Obviously, India is a growing market. I think it's the second fastest growing economy in the world compared to China, and this was a $1 billion deal. And so,
Mhm.
it still seems like there's confidence, with respect to operators around the globe in Nokia. I think they've registered, 40 to 45, 5G wins around the world. And, in their private networking business unit, Nokia Enterprise continues to register pretty decent performance. I read today a 19%, increase in bookings there. So,
Mhm.
but, from your perspective, Anshel, does this dig Nokia out of their financial hole?
I'm not entirely sure. The reason why is because this isn't $1 billion in 1 year. This is a multi-year deal.
Yeah.
I think what Nokia needs to do is continue being successful in the areas where they've done well, and address the concerns of where they haven't particularly done well.
Hmm.
Um, I think them opening up their platform for more open standards, I think
Hmm.
is something that has benefited them.
Sure.
And I think they're kind of because they're not necessarily the largest anymore. They're definitely having to be more agile and aggressive with what they do.
Yeah.
And I think for a while they just weren't, and it their competitors took advantage of that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's very promising, and I think we should definitely watch to see how things progress, over the course of the next year or two, because the 5G race has just begun. Some
Yeah.
people are already calling themselves the winners, but I don't think you will know who won the 5G race for probably 5 years or more.
Yeah. No, I agree. And another thing to note too, their CEO, Suri is stepping down, and they'll have a new executive in place. I believe it's in the fall, and so I think this provides them some nice headwind as they move into that management tradition, that transition. And I think that's always a good thing. I think new blood is a good thing, especially at the very top. So it'll be interesting to kind of keep tabs on them. Let's shift a little bit and talk about kind of the U.S. and there's been a lot of discussion around, how do we get 5G out to rural? I read recently where, several Chinese operators with Huawei, they put a 5G base station on Mount Everest. It's incredible. Talk about
Right.
rural, right?
Yeah.
So I know you've got some insight into this 5G rural fund that's been discussed. So why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, so it's a new fund that's specifically targeted towards bringing 5G to rural areas. I have some friends who live in rural areas, and they struggle to get speeds anywhere near what we're experiencing in the cities.
Hmm.
That's with 4G. So the gap with 5G will only widen,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of people that don't fit into the primary plans of a lot of operators. So the FCC has established a $9 billion fund
Hmm.
um, to help basically support the deployment of rural networks, have 5G access and improve internet speeds, coverage, etc. But the problem is that most carriers, if you look at their promises to their customers, a lot of them are, they're in the 90s. No one's guaranteeing particularly, 100% coverage of the country, because it's really difficult to cover some places and expensive, and there's very
The
little
economics.
ROI.
Yeah,
So
the
the economics
economics.
of it don't
Yeah.
work, and because of that, the FCC has to go in and establish this fund. But there's a lot of people who have a lot of experience in, rural broadband and
Hmm.
cellular coverage that aren't particularly fond of this fund's proposed, rules. They
Hmm.
think that, there need to be more strict requirements on, you know, first of all, the carriers are, giving these maps out and saying they've got coverage in certain areas, and then they don't. So one of the fundamental problems with, even establishing this fund and determining where coverage is needed and funding
Hmm.
supplied is that the base level coverage is not what carriers are claiming it is.
Right.
So there's that's I think the first problem.
Got it.
And yeah, I think there's definitely some potential technologies out there. Like SES Networks has a satellite 5G deployment in a box, basically, that they've
Hmm.
shown at last MWC, because there is no MWC 2020,
Right.
and they basically use it as kind of a edge compute and edge cell network that complements an already existing one, but gives it more bandwidth
Yeah.
and allows people to pull data more quickly as opposed to having to pull it from a cloud server 500 miles away.
Yeah. Yeah. The
So there's
latency, right? It reduces
exactly,
the distance. It's low orbit. It's a low orbit satellite network. It's
yeah,
not the traditional terrestrial that's much further in the sky, and the latency would it would kill it.
yeah.
The
So the
distance.
interesting thing is that I think it's good that there's a rural fund and that it's happening. But
Hmm.
I think a lot of people have to reconsider how we even start distributing it, because they say it's going to, the phase one is $8 billion
Yeah.
over the course of 10 years, and then there's another phase after that, but I'm not sure that will be enough money or quickly enough.
Right. And do you think U.S. Cellular, because their footprint, I mean, they're considered, the tier, two behind, now what represents, the big three and the new
Hmm.
T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T. Do you feel like U.S. Cellular has the most to benefit from this new rural fund?
Not particularly, just because I mean they could if they wanted to, if they had the resources to really do it. I have a feeling that the big one that will actually utilize this the most will probably be T-Mobile,
Okay.
because they have the spectrum and they have the right frequencies to do it.
Yeah.
Because you could put, a decent amount of 2.5 gigahertz in the small town center, and the 600 megahertz to cover the most of the town, and then
Sure.
millimeter wave where you have very small spots of high density people. Because even small towns have places where everybody congregates. So
Right. Yeah.
I think right now, if you look at who's in the position to do this the best,
Yeah.
it would be either AT&T or T-Mobile.
Yeah, I like T-Mobile's footprint. We've talked about that before. They're covering the low, mid, and high band. So great stuff, man. Well, let's shift to my third and final topic for the week. You touched on, kind of openness and, Dish Networks. They're one of the benefactors of the new T-Mobile. Part of that deal was, divesting some spectrum holdings, giving them access to retail locations, helping them get their network off the ground. I wasn't surprised to see the news this week that they're taking an open RAN approach to building out the radio access network.
Hmm.
When you look at other operators like Reliance Geo, and they're using these technologies. Not only you need to be very agile, but also be very very cost eruptive. And so Dish announced this week that they're partnering with Mavenir with respect to deploying the Mavenir Open RAN solution. And in a nutshell, it's taking software, network function, and being able to deploy that on standard commercial servers. And that's certainly very capex disruptive compared to the traditional purpose-built infrastructure that you see offered, by the traditional providers like Samsung Networks, Nokia, and Ericsson. So I think this is a great move. I'm not surprised that they're going to use Open RAN as well. They should probably, they'll be investigating virtualized core and that sort of thing. And it'll be interesting to see. There's a timeline, right? That Dish has to get this stuff deployed, or
Right.
they pay a huge penalty to the FCC in the neighborhood of billions of dollars. So any additional perspective on that announcement from your perspective?
I think it shows that Dish is, moving forward with their network, and that they're not going to do what they've done in the past and kind of just sit on the spectrum and act like no one's going to hold them accountable to it.
Yeah.
It sounds like they actually are going to do it, which I think is important because there need to be more operators. And if this new T-Mobile merger with Sprint is really going to be considered something that's legit, this needs to happen as well.
Hmm.
And I think it would be great to see them do something, low cost, that's really competitive, that gives people more choice.
Yeah.
And I think going with a open RAN approach um, is probably the best way for them to accomplish that by reducing costs and having flexibility.
Yeah, yeah, and I think Rakuten has proven that as well, right? They seem to be sort of the poster child for using, disaggregation and, virtualization and that sort of thing. So there's a, there's a prior, sort of proof point there that points to, the power of them doing this. So awesome. So let's wrap up. I know your third topic, you want to talk a little bit about Qualcomm
Sure.
and what they're doing with respect to driving their overall 5G ecosystem and strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's more almost a commentary on the entire 5G industry,
Hmm.
because the CEO was kind of like did an interview at you know, with a different group. They were doing like a panel, and basically, if you look at 5G is going to impact the world,
Hmm.
he basically said, without a 5G strategy, you're going to get left behind. And
Hmm.
I thought it was really interesting because I think a lot of people are forgetting that regardless of the economic conditions that we're in today, the 5G momentum has begun, and it's
Hmm.
like a train, and you can't stop it. So
Yeah,
you better plan for it rather than get hit by it.
I
Because
like that.
if you're not if you're not planning for 5G, your competitors are, and they're
Right.
going to be ready or they're already preparing. And because 5G covers virtually almost every industry, you know,
Hmm.
eh, there's going to be a different time frame for each industry because, like right now, it's still kind of very mobile focused.
Right.
But we're starting to work into private networks and stuff,
Yeah.
and I think that over time, if you're not deploying 5G in one way or another, or at least considering how it affects your business, you're going to get left behind, and your competitors are going to eat your lunch or drink your milkshake.
I agree. The use cases are compelling. You touched on private networking, factory automation. I mean, Wi-Fi will still play a part, but
Of
based on
course,
propagation, it's
security.
secure. Yeah, exactly. And even other use cases like transportation and logistics, just purely the incredibly low, latency capabilities of 5G and that faster throughput over LTE is it's really going to be transformative. And I mean, the U.S. has been behind this, from the get-go. The president, the current administration views 5G as a linchpin that can
Right.
really drive positive GDP growth. And
And
so,
I totally agree. I've written a paper about it.
there you go. Yeah, we should share that with our viewers if they
Definitely.
if they hit us up here. Well, that's all the time we have this week. Anshel, why don't you take us home?
All right. So we hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog on Twitter. Please have a great weekend and tune in to us next time.